Okay, well, hello. We are going to do a fairly brief refresher and update on Housing First today. We will use 3 videos in the course of this training. Really, it's maybe going to last 30 minutes at most. The first 2/3 of it is going to be a refresher for those who have learned about Housing First previously. This will just will provide sort of an update and a refresher in terms of what Housing First is. For those of you who might be new to the Housing First approach, this will give you just a basic understanding of what Housing First is. The last segment of the training will look at some of the issues with implementing Housing First. What are the flaws? What are the dangers in using a Housing First approach? So with that, let's get started. Housing First is not a program, it's not a project, it's an approach. It's an approach to homelessness that says that the most important thing we can do, and the first thing we can do for people who are homeless, is provide them with a home. Here's my phone. This happens to all of us. So we used to operate, and by we, I mean everybody who worked in homeless, used to operate under an approach that was different, that said that people could not be placed in permanent housing, could not succeed in permanent housing until and unless they were housing ready. So we had this system that started with outreach, where people who were experiencing homelessness came to us, or we found them through our outreach workers. And first we'd place them in an emergency shelter for a short period of time, and then they'd move into transitional housing for up to 2 years. And while they're in transitional housing, we were working with them to resolve the problems that might have led to their homelessness, addressing substance abuse or mental health challenges, repairing credit, giving them coursework, say, or lessons in home maintenance, in landlord-tenant relationships, in household budgeting. And then at the end of that period, when we felt they were housing ready, only at that point would we place them in permanent housing or offer them permanent housing. What we found is that rarely worked in that way. And so Housing First looks at an approach that says, the biggest need is shelter. And until we meet the need for stable shelter, they really can't address these other problems. If you took psychology in high school or college, you might remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it basically had, I think, 5 different categories of need. At the top was food and shelter. And if the needs for food and shelter were not met, you really couldn't focus on any other needs. So that's what Housing First is. At its best, Housing First quickly and successfully connects people to permanent housing. It does not have preconditions, doesn't throw up barriers, doesn't say you have to be sober, you have to be in treatment. It doesn't even say you have to participate in supportive services. Supportive services are voluntary. That was a piece that took us a long time to wrap our heads around. And by us, I mean those who are working in homelessness across the country. We resisted that. How can we possibly put people in housing and not require that they meet treatment goals? Well, we learned. So for a basic primer to Housing First, I'm going to look at Stephen Getz from Canada, who's going to talk just kind of an overview of Housing First. And the reason I selected this is a lot of the initial work in Housing First really was from Canada.
As Housing First becomes more and more recognized as an effective and humane approach to homelessness, questions arise about exactly what does it mean, how does it work, And can I do it in my community? What we're going to do is we're going to talk about housing first, a definition of it, and look at all those kinds of questions. We do know this, that housing first means doing things differently. For too long in the homelessness sector, we've had to rely on emergency services to deal with homelessness. And in many cases, we've worked ourselves into a situation where we assume that people have to be made ready to get housing, either by dealing with their mental health issues first or their addictions issues. Housing first takes a different approach and says, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Everybody deserves housing, it's a right. And in fact, people's recovery can improve once they have housing. It's actually the experience of being homeless that may exacerbate the mental health and addictions issues. The underlying principle of housing first is that people move forward in their lives more successfully if they have housing first. This is as true for you and me as it is for somebody who experiences homelessness. And so we really have to consider that as a radical change in terms of how we deal with this issue. People need to be housed, and they also need supports that they determine are necessary in order to get there. Often people think about housing first as simply taking people and dumping them into housing in the suburbs, isolated, without support, and that this is hardly a way to address the needs of any person. But in fact, housing first is a very well thought out process and approach that ensures that people do get the kinds of supports that they need. Housing first as an approach goes way back, and in fact, there's examples of housing first like programs in Canada that go back to the 1980s. But it was really the work of Samson Barris, who is Canadian, mind you, who worked at the Pathways program in New York City, who really put housing first on the map. That program outlined the first core principles of housing first, developed the methodology and the philosophy, and really moved forward in making housing first an approach that was evidence-based and showed that we can really deal with homelessness in this new kind of way. And the evidence-based aspect is really important. We can't just come up with solutions and assume that they're okay because we think they're okay. We need to know that these things work. And one of the great things about Housing First is, as an intervention in homelessness, it is one of the best documented interventions that there is. The body of evidence that shows that Housing First works is overwhelming. The recent At Home Shaswa project in Canada, which is the largest project on Housing First ever done, shows conclusively that it works. That you can take the most hardcore, chronically homeless person with complex mental health issues and addictions issues, and you put them in housing, and you know what? Not only do they stay housed, they do better. We have to stop thinking that chronically homeless people want to be homeless or that they can't be housed, because the evidence is there. The debate is now over. Housing First works.
So there you have it, a quick summary of Housing First from Stephen Getz in Canada. When I first learned of Housing First, something that stayed with me was a question that a presenter asked in a training much like this, only it was face-to-face. The trainer said, "Did you take driver ed in high school?" And I said, "Yeah." And the trainer said, "So did you learn more about how to drive from the classroom or from behind the wheel?" And like you, I suspect, I said, well, I learned a lot more behind the wheel from sitting in the classroom, learning about what it's like to be behind the wheel. It actually helped to be behind the wheel. So it is with housing. People learn how to be homed by being homed, not by going to class. So what does Housing First look like on the ground? It means that when we're selecting people for housing, when we're referring people to housing, we're screening them in. We're not screening them out. We're not using eligibility criteria to keep people out. We're using eligibility criteria to get people in. When it works well, it means that we do this quickly, that we move people as quickly as possible into housing, even those with greatest barriers. We do this quickly, as quickly as we can. And as we said, we do not require service participation. We don't require sobriety. We don't require compliance with medication. Another thing about Housing First is that under Housing First practices, those who are most in need are served first. So it's more like an emergency room than like a McDonald's. In an emergency room, if you go there with a minor injury and somebody comes in with a heart attack, they're going to take care of that person with a heart attack before they take care of you. McDonald's, you wait in line and you take your turn. So we're more like an emergency room. Those who are most at risk, those who have the highest level of needs, those who are most vulnerable, always go to the top of the list. They are served first. So here in South Central Illinois, we look at, first of all, how long somebody's been homeless. Second, how severe their disabilities. And then we have some other criteria that we look at. But mostly it's how long you've been homeless and how severe your disabilities are. Why do we do this? We do this because our hardest core cases, the people who are most difficult to work with, are those who cost our systems the most money. They cost the most money in terms of law enforcement. They cost the most money in terms of hospital time, treatment time, all kinds of issues that cost money to the public. So if we can get them stably housed, we actually save money. And we measure how well we're doing. Every one of our projects in South Central Illinois that's funded by HUD, either directly through Continuum of Care or indirectly through the ESG program, every one of those projects annually takes a self-assessment. It's on an Excel sheet, so they do it online, and they identify what type of project they have, and that spits out some questions that then gives them a score and indicates to them how well they're complying with our Housing First principles and gives them some ideas of where they can improve. Okay, about 5 years ago, The Daily Show, back when Jon Stewart hosted it, did an episode on Housing First, looking at how it works in the state of Utah. Now, I'm sure that some of you have seen this before because I've used this video over and over again in training. In fact, I think we did it at a semi-annual meeting down Litchfield a couple of years ago. It's worth seeing again, and if you haven't seen it again, I'm sure you'll enjoy kind of the dry humor and the presentation of Housing First.
You know, I'll tell you one thing. Nobody likes homelessness. I'm very controversial. Least of all the homeless. But what can be done? Salt Lake City, Utah has a plan that will blow your mind. Hassan Minaj, report.
Oops. Okay, we're going to try to bring up that video again later. I will move on with the slideshow. So in this video, there's a gentleman, Lloyd Pendleton from Utah, who's using good humor and a lot of fun, explains how Housing First in Utah has saved the state money and has led to housing for lots of people. I'm having trouble advancing it right now. Sorry. There. So we're going to move on to the what's missing from Housing First. What are the issues that cause Housing First to not succeed all the time? And I identify these as 4 flaws. The first flaw is that housing alone does not cure the conditions that cause homelessness. Sometimes we tend to think of Housing First as being housing only. We focus on putting people in housing, and we don't focus on addressing their needs through a voluntary system. So as our last video, and we're hoping this works, I want you to see a short debate really between Dennis Watson, who teaches social and behavioral science at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, and Paul Shaw, who's the chief operating officer at a shelter in Indianapolis, as they discuss Housing First.
They're just dumped into the apartment and then they're out on their own.
It's the one thing that we have scientific evidence that actually is working. The Housing First model was created as a way to eliminate barriers to housing. It lets them in the door without any prerequisites, and it says that we're going to work with these people where they're at. We're not going to force them to engage in any services they don't want, with the goal that over time people, once they've had their basic needs of shelter met, that they will then choose to engage in services of their own volition.
The homeless person comes to us for services. We require that they meet certain specifications. They work towards sobriety. Housing First, I think it works in certain situations, but the problem is that they're kind of left in these apartments by themselves and they're out on their own. They had a problem to start with. You know, it could have been drugs or it could have been alcohol or whatever. But they need help other than just being free housing.
It shouldn't be that we just put people in their apartments and let them sit. The one thing people must agree to is to engage with and meet with a case manager on a regular basis.
If a homeless person comes to us for services, we let them into the mission and do an evaluation of what their needs are. If it's a drug problem, then we would put them through a 10-step program.
That model works for the majority of individuals. It does not work for individuals who are chronically homeless with very, very severe substance use and mental health needs, because those individuals tend to, either they don't get into programming or they get kicked out right after they get into programming.
I think it is very important to have a set of rules. I mean, you have to get up at a certain time. You get up at 6:30 in the morning. You have to be in the building at 9 o'clock.
People in Housing First should be subject to the same rules that anyone in market rate housing is subject to. If you do something that is against your lease, then that is a problem, and that has to be treated as a problem. But it does say that we don't kick people out of their housing or, evict people from their housing because they do something that we consider to be undesirable that someone who has money could get away with. So there's really no one way to really appropriately house anyone, and there's no one model that should be used to house every single type of homeless person.
So that was kind of interesting discussion, and I think most of us, certainly a few years ago, we were where Paul Shaw is, and now we're probably more where Dennis is, that we recognize the value of Housing First, but we don't look at it as a panacea. So again, the first issue is that when you do Housing First, it's not housing only. It's not putting somebody in a house, paying for the rent for that unit and leaving them be. Even though services are voluntary, what's not voluntary is staying in contact with that person. Even if a person rejects the specific services you might offer, you still are obligated to check in on that person. We call that case management, but just stopping by and seeing them, checking on the phone every now and then. How are you doing? Checking in, showing concern for them. The second thing I want to address with Housing First is that it does not consider the needs for positive community and socialization. Many times when we place people in housing, we place them in a small apartment that's fairly isolated from other people, And even if they participate in services, that might mean a few hours a week of going to an AA meeting or visiting with their counselor, maybe a home visit once or twice a week. That leaves a lot of time unfilled. And that can be dangerous, having a lot of time on their hands. This really came home to me several years ago when I was working with the city of St. Louis, and we were making plans to clear out a large homeless encampment north of downtown along the river. Outreach workers from various agencies got to know everybody in the encampment, got by name, and we're working with them saying, listen, we're going to have bulldozing day on such and such a day, and you will be relocated to a home of your own on that day. And we had housing lined up. We were surprised, and we shouldn't have been, but we were surprised by how resistant people were to that. And what we failed to fully realize was that even in those encampments with, shelters built out of construction materials that were stolen from construction sites or tents with holes in the roof, they had a community. In fact, there were 3 communities, 3 little towns. Each of them had elected a mayor. Each of them had safety patrols that worked with, varying degrees of success and in protecting the residents of those communities against crime and helping people who overdosed. Didn't work perfectly. There was a lot of violence there, but they still had that sense of community. Lots of them had pets. They had cats and dogs, and they didn't want to give that up. And I think it's important for us to realize that there is a need for community. There is a need for us to foster positive community, positive activities. It's not just putting a person in a house and providing them with services. Third thing, and this is something we've really noticed in South Central, is that because Housing First puts people who have the most needs and the most vulnerabilities at the top of the list, there are people who are stuck in the middle of the list forever because somebody else with greater needs is always jumping to the top of the list. That's a problem. Housing First does not really address those folks who maybe don't have disabilities but are homeless, or who have very minor disabilities and are homeless. They never get to the top of the list, or they never get housing. And that really relates to the last thing, which is, if we view Housing First as the be all and the end all, as the answer to homelessness, that's faulty, because it does not address the real root cause of homelessness. The real root cause of homelessness is not disability. The real root cause of homelessness is we don't have enough housing that is decent, safe, and affordable. Even in South Central Illinois, which is not a low housing area in terms of housing resources, we just can't find enough units for the people who are on the waiting list. It's much, much worse in large metropolitan areas of our country. But if we focus on Housing First, we really tend to lose our focus on what's causing homelessness, which is the shortage of decent, safe, affordable housing for everybody. So with that, where do we go from here? Well, we need to use Housing First, recognize that it's a valuable tool, but again, it's not the cure-all. It's not the answer to everything. We need to make sure that when we do Housing First, it's not housing only, that we recognize the need for services and that wraparound services are part of Housing First. We need to always create and support and foster opportunities for people to interact with each other in a positive way, so that they don't have time on their hands, and so that they can become productive, giving, contributing members of society. And we need always, always to advocate for more and better housing. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for watching. With one thing though, the video that we did not get, we're going to put that link to that video out on the email when we send out this training, so that everybody can watch that on their own time. Again, thank you for watching.